Dr. Amanda Lucia, who is professor of religious studies there. And she is the person who is really at the forefront of looking at modern yoga movements, has published a very well-received book on Amici, the Hugging Guru, and has current work underway that she'll be sharing with us on similar topics about guru-disciple relationships. She did her PhD at the University of Chicago and is, I think, happy to be living in California, and we've been very thrilled to have her as a neighbor. Now, I want to turn this, before we go to Amanda, to Amy, just to have a quick check-in to see if there's anything more we need to talk about or any housekeeping that we should tend to.
Of course, welcome. My name is Amy Osborne, and I'm the Program Associate for Graduate Yoga Studies. I'm also an alum of Cohort 2. We're excited to have members of both Cohorts 7 and 8 here with us tonight. And we'll be, I think it's noteworthy to share that we'll be hosting our 9th annual Yoga Day coming up virtually. That will be 6:30 in the morning to 7:30 at night. Might even be 6 in the morning. In order to accommodate a global audience with our friends in India and elsewhere. And we'll have lectures, asana, classes, and meditation all day. So if you haven't already, we will be sending out a newsletter with registration for that. It is free and open to the public, October 24th. That's a Saturday. So thank you for being here. We look forward to seeing more of you. And thank you, Dr. Lucia, for sharing tonight.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming to yet another Zoom room. I can't imagine how fatigued we must all be. I know some of us are in school, some of us are teaching, but I really appreciate this opportunity. I want to thank LMU and, of course, Amy and Serenity and Tana and everybody else, and Chris, of course, for the invitation. It's very cool to be here again at LMU. I also want to start off with a land acknowledgement for the Gabrielino, and Tongva peoples whose land I guess LMU sits on, not necessarily me here in Pomona, which is Tongva and others as we move toward the Inland Empire. But and I really struggle with land acknowledgements because they're not enough. And in some ways they're very like performative politic that we all do. And we're going to be talking a little bit today about performative politics and what that means. But it's a beginning and it's at least a good place to start. I also want to start here at the outset, recognizing the cataclysmic shifts that are happening in our country. I know that a lot of you probably clicked over from the vice presidential debate to come here, and I really appreciate that. And I'm not sure where your time would be better spent, but I'm grateful that you've decided to come here. This country, of course, as you know, we've all lived through this summer, has been in upheaval since George Floyd's death, his murder on March 25th, and Breonna Taylor. And as the summer accelerated, it seemed like race and whiteness became a part of the national conversation in so many positive ways that seem kind of hopeful in a way, but then also in really disturbing ways as we see the rise of neo-Nazi fascism and overt racism coming from all kinds of high levels and kind of the breadth of it in our society. So I want to be clear that this book is not part of that, really. In some sense, I think there's a lot of people writing right now, and there's a lot of people that we should be listening to, but the important thing that I want to convey to you is that this research began in 2011, and it really ended in 2019. So it was in the proof stages, meaning like when the book was already very angry when you move things around, that we had George Floyd's death, and the kind of public discourse about the movement for Black Lives that we've had this summer. Now, that's not to say that it didn't matter. Of course, in 2015 was when Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives really began to formulate into a group of 60 different organizations coalitioning together. But I think it's important for us to recognize that that really wasn't a character in my field sites, hardly at all. And I think that says something. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. In fact, there has been a lot of talk and a lot of discussion this summer that is hopeful. And some of these festivals I'm going to be talking about today are, for the first time in their lineups, when they're happening, if they're happening online, are diversifying. And that's pretty interesting to me to see what kind of cataclysmic shifts are happening right now. But to begin, I'll start with the beginning, which is how this book started and how I even got involved in writing something that became what is now the book called White Utopias that will come out just next week. So it starts like a bedtime story, right? Back in 2011, when I took my daughter to preschool and I picked up a flyer for a thing called Bhakti Fest. And I was brand new faculty here at UC Riverside, not here, but you know, where I am here. And I thought, fantastic, this is a really great opportunity. I'm gonna go meet all of the Indian Hindus in the LA Basin area. And that will give me a good start to knowing this community. And anyone who's been to Bhakti Fest is joking and laughing with me, because you know that when I arrived there was nary a Hindu in sight, or Indian Hindu, I should say, South Asian Hindu in sight. A lot of mostly yoga practitioners, kirtan musicians, ISKCON devotees, I met Osho devotees, all kinds of very serious yogis and devotees and spiritual people, but very few Indians. So from there, I was really intrigued as to what this whole scene was about, and I began to go to more festivals to kind of follow the people, thinking this might be the beginning of an ethnographic project. So here's where I ended up. From Bhakti Fest, I followed people into its sister festival of Shakti Fest. And you can see this is starting right here at the beginning, you can all see my screen, correct? Yeah, good, okay. 2011 and Shakti Fest in 2012. And then I went to Wanderlusts, adding in another layer of yoga festivals, and started off in Oahu in 2014, and then Squaw Valley, a couple of Wanderlusts in the city, one in Quebec, one in Australia, one in New Zealand. And from there, I began to see more familiar faces who tipped me off to go to Lightning in a Bottle, where there were also a lot of yoga teachers that were overlapping with these other scenes. And then finally, I felt like I should go to the kind of parent of all of the transformational festivals and to spend time at Burning Man, where in fact, a lot of these same yoga teachers were also teaching or running camps, or offering whatever they were giving to the public. So most fundamentally, the book begins to argue that these kinds of transformational festivals are educational sites, or what we might even call like invisible institutions for the spiritual but not religious, this SBNR category that you're going to hear me talk about again and again. People who are looking to learn something about spirituality, whether it be through barefoot hiking or yoga or tantra or mantra recitation or sound bath healing, whatever it may be. But they're learning in these spaces. And so I think they're very important spaces to share information for what we might call the unchurched population. And I felt like all of these festivals were very, very unique. You could have added lots of other festivals to these. I don't mean to imply that they're a singular category, but that they all kind of had this impulse of bringing a community together with a shared purpose in mind. And there was a lot of kind of demographic overlap among them. So I don't mean to say they're the same, but they are common in one factor, which is that they're almost all white, which was striking to me as well, is why were whites congregating in these specific ways, almost with intention. So To give you a bit of demographics, Burning Man is the most diverse. What was it, 2017? It came out as 77.1% non-Hispanic white. And the year before, I believe it was 83% non-Hispanic white. So it's diversifying quite rapidly in recent years. From there, Lightning in a Bottle is about the same. Wanderlusts appeared to be even whiter, maybe 90% white or so. And then Bhakti and Shakti Fest were even whiter, with, I would say, upwards of 95% white. And so I found that it was very interesting that the higher the level of religious exoticism in these festivals, the whiter they tended to be. So it wasn't really my intent, as you can see, to study whiteness, but it became a very pivotal axis around which my research began to turn. Now, somewhere in the middle of all of this, I think I was listening to NPR and I heard Rich Benjamin, who is a fascinating ethnographer, sociologist. He wrote a book called White Utopias, and he was looking at these exurban enclaves where white people were moving with kind of a gated community sanctuary of whiteness. And he's an African-American journalist and author. So he had this fascinating ethnography that he was doing, living and kind of interacting among these communities for a couple of years. But what was interesting to me was that he found that his definition of Whiteopia was a place that was whiter than the nation, its respective region, and its state. It also demonstrates a considerable growth from white migrants and has, quote, an ineffable social charisma, or a pleasant look and feel. And he looked at why people were moving into these spaces, and he found that it was a lot about anxieties about modernity and looking for a safe place to raise their children. So this notion of like precarity and a search for strong community of connection. And what is interesting is that these places were attracting whites who we wouldn't usually position on the right. So Republicans, white supremacists, evangelicals, political conservatives. But while I was listening to him, I was thinking that these very same factors are at play among the populations who are usually understood to be the opposite. So Democrats and liberals and the spiritual but not religious, and those who would celebrate multiculturalism. But also kind of like the exurban Whiteopias, these people were looking for strong communities and feelings of safe and sanctuary. And so I wanted to know why these were kind of operating in similar ways, even though they were such different people ideologically. I also fundamentally agree with Benjamin's conclusion, where he says that Whiteopia operates at the level of conscious and unconscious bias, that it's possible for people to be in Whiteopia not for racist reasons, though it has racist outcomes. So I anticipated, kind of thinking about these two communities together, that there were many people in the SBNR Transformational Festival or yoga community worlds who would be absolutely appalled at any presumed similitude. But this is not really an accusation in some sense, it's just a demographic fact. And so part of what my research became then was to interrogate that fact. And it seems like, you know, perhaps if these festivals were happening in a very white state like Maine or something like that, then we might understand it a bit better. But when they're happening in California, where the white population in California is 38%, it really starts to show us that there is a selective attraction of whites to these spaces. That even though they're focused on, say, Hindu devotionalism, like Bhakti and Shakti Fest, or yoga, which is an Indic form, as you well know, in Wanderlust, or one of the principles of Burning Man is radical inclusion. So they seem to be going against their kind of ethos in some way. So where is the white's only sign, and why is it hung? Who is it put there by, and for what purpose? So you can see the peak year that I was doing festivals was about 2014. I went to 4 different Wanderlusts. I went to Shakti Fest and Bhakti Fest and LIB. That was a busy year. The busiest time though really became in 2018 when I took over leadership of a camp in Black Rock City at Burning Man, and I still hold that position. So I want to disclose that. I still run the Black Rock Bakery if and when Burning Man ever happens in person again. Now, in these festivals, I felt like I had to narrow, right? I couldn't just talk about them in general. And one of the ways in which I did that was to focus on yoga. And you might say, well, they all offer different levels of yoga, but yoga is in the top 10 these are from the program books of the different festivals. So I'm going to blow through this a little bit quickly, but I hope you can see. So for Shakti Fest, yoga was the #1 offering. For Bhakti Fest, it was also the #1 offering. And you can see the numbers barely here, about 72 yoga classes offered in the course of the weekend. And that was back in 2013. The festival has grown considerably since then. I chose a random wanderlust, which was at Oahu, the first one I went to, where yoga ranked #2, second to running, hiking, surfing, athletics kind of things. Lightning in a bottle, live music way outpaces yoga, but yoga is the second most common offering that people are doing there. Now, Burning Man has got such a bad rep for parties and drugs that I understand if you think that's all that happens at Burning Man, but in fact, yoga is also in the top 10 of the offerings at Burning Man. So down here at #9, you know, after live music again, and certainly way after the party, this is also not including, though, all of the camps that run yoga programming all day, every day. And so they would not be listed in the program book. So the numbers of yoga at Burning Man are actually really quite high because the festival is also so very large, right? 80,000 people in the desert doing a lot of different things. So these festivals were very affective, experiential, and tactile events. So I'm going to give you a few quotes just to kind of start off. Oh, these are the different yoga teachers, actually, before I go into that. So these are all pseudonyms that I've given the different yoga teachers. So don't try to recognize anybody, but these are their Instagram numbers. You can tell that they all have considerable followings. And then if you look here at the festivals, you can tell that Burning Man is by far the largest. Well, the followings for the others are not much to kind of shake a stick at. So this is Eli Gordon, who opens up in his soft, lilting voice during his full-day intensive workshop. He invites a small group of dedicated yogis to enter into the waters of consciousness with a series of deep breaths. And as he speaks, he braided together an aura of sacrality and ideas drawn from different religious traditions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Zen, Sufism, and Native American traditions. His poetic tapestries created a narrative that reveal humanity and the earth in crisis. There's a problem with modernity and a dire need for a solution. And like many others before him, he characterizes this in terms of a recovery project. So ancient wisdom that has been lost and needs to be found and revitalized. So this is his quote here. He says, Einstein said very beautifully, the ancient people seem to have understood something very important that we have lost. And the answer is not, of course, to go back to the way things were thousands of years ago, because that would deny all of what's happened since. This evolutionary wave is coming together, which is so beautifully evident here in the desert. All of these practices and different tribal members and colors of the rainbow creating a new way. There are certain principles which are so important, and of course, nothing is more important than the mother, the earth. So in these few sentences, he blends together an admiration for science, but also the mourning for the loss of pre-modern knowledge, a demand for a new evolution, an affirmation of creating a bricolage of practices and people for spiritual innovation, a celebration of the unification of tribes, and a demand for the centrality of ecology. So these are the ideals, and yoga is the method. He invited his practitioners to join in this evolutionary wave to create a new way, but his vision of, quote, different tribal members and colors of the rainbow coming together to present at Shakti Fest, or to be present, sorry, at Shakti Fest in his yoga class didn't really seem to actualize. His utopian vision didn't match the demographic reality of the predominantly white participants. Even though, that is to say, they used the language of tribe and claimed that we are all indigenous to unify their communities. I would argue that this is part of a fundamentally fundamentally base recognition of a dystopian reality that we live in and the goal of a utopian future. Now, I know some of you guys recognize Mark Whitwell here, and he's allowed me to use his image, and that is not a quote. Eli Gordon is not Mark Whitwell, so don't do your math in your head. But I show this to you because of this guy's clever and wonderful tattoo, right? This idea that is kind of understanding of dystopian reality in the yoga class, trying to imagine a different utopia of what life could be. So in his research on the stickiness of whiteness, or what he calls the viscosity of whiteness, Arun Saldana writes in his research on Psytrance parties in Goa, that it's a commonplace assumption that whites have for a long time been fascinated and transformed by drawing on other people's cultures and landscapes. Yet, the fact that white appropriations of otherness were fueled by a conscious effort to transcend the constraints of white society. That exoticism and primitivism, though intertwined with colonial subjugation, also tell of the self-critique and self-transformation of whites has seldom been put at the center of theorization. And essentially, that's the whole point of White Utopias. The book that I created is an attempt to look at the ways in which the uncomfortable juxtaposition between problematic religious exoticism and productive self-critique and self-transformation. So I argue that these populations identify with alterity to forge personal solutions to the crises of modernity. In so doing, they reject systems of white supremacy in which they are inevitably enmeshed, but they do so from within the safe spaces of white ethnic homogeneity. So in festivals, they speak in self-affirming echo chambers that imagine evolutionary paths to enlightenment, but also rarely engage with diverse ethnic environments and populations. My research also revealed that the more yogic the field, the more it focused on internal self-transformation rather than social change. So just recently, Sean Korn came out with a book where she argues that our evolution is the revolution. But I didn't find that a majority of people were directing attention to her broader humanitarian project and political project, as we've seen in the last week or so. What I found was that most people were focused on their internal revolution. And I focused on chapters 3 and chapter 4 on asceticism and mysticism as two modalities that I saw people returning to again and again. So I'm going to outline a little bit about the book, and then I know that most of you are interested in yoga, so I'm going to pause for a heartbeat or so on chapter 2, which is about rhetoric of authority and authenticity in yoga. And then I'll come back around to questions and we can talk further. So the book starts with this notion of religious exoticism, and the assessment, essentially what Philip Jenkins explains, that the perennial interest in Native Americans grows and shrinks in inverse proportion to satisfaction with mainstream society. Throughout American history, romantic Indian images are most sought after in eras of alienation and crisis. So what he argues is that one of the fundamental errors of the 1960s counterculture was to think that they were the first ones who had done this, that everything before them was like backwards and racist. But in fact, we see again and again and again in crises in Western society and American society, there's a romantic imagining of the exotic other that's brought into the mainstream and consumed by white Americans. So too, with contemporary turns to the exotic, that there seeks a solution to feelings of malaise and dislocation derived from what Gita Mehta argues as feeling uprooted from cultural traditions, community belonging, and spiritual meaning. Exoticism begins with a salient critique of hegemonic Western modernity, but instead of tackling those challenges through reform or rebellion or revolution, this population looks to inhabit other social models for alternative solutions, and more predominantly to find therapeutic and existential meaning. So its solutions are often more therapeutic than political, aimed to alleviate the feeling of, quote, rampant alienation that characterizes modernity. the sense of being rootless and adrift, cut off from tradition and history. The exotic other then is established as an unsullied pre-modern subject and diametrically opposed to the cold conformity and ecological devastation of white America, the quote unquote dead city, whose own cultural heritage and meaning seems like a well run dry. So this is something I heard again and again in the field where people are looking for roots and finding them in Indian and native traditions. Indian very broadly in the sense of religions rooted in ancient India, so Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. Although I was told just this week that there's a complete anachronism, right, to use isms in regard to the ancient world. So keep that in mind, since Chris is looking at me right there. So one of the characteristics of religious exoticism is that it dissociates from real actors in favor of a romantic imaginary, creating indices that are more flexible than their flesh and blood reference. So I look at these modes of appropriation and dissociation and argue that while participants have profound, transformative, life-altering experiences in these fields, the catalysts for such experience are made available through what Indigenous scholar Eileen Morton Robinson calls white possessivism. Or put simply, the white, and particularly in her research, settler colonial propensity to believe that one can have access to and ownership of anything and everything. The result is discordant transformational worlds that incorporate both the violence of cultural appropriation and the wonders of self-transformation. So to get at the how on this, so that's kind of the broad base of chapter 1 starting off. And then I wanted to get at the particularity. So how is this actually done? And I used the case study of yoga to look very closely at, sorry, there's just a few images, at the rhetoric for how practices cultural appropriation is such a kind of flippant word that gets used all the time. I wanted to see actually what are the strategies of garnering authority over whites over a brown skin cultural form, and how does it work? So what I found when I was listening to yoga classes is that there was kind of an almost obsessive or compulsive or perseveration on discourses of authenticity. So being one's authentic self, doing an authentic practice, all kinds of ways in which that word was being used. And I came to the conclusion after reading a whole lot on this topic that discourses of authenticity are in fact about authority. And in fact, they have the same Latin root. And I found two primary strategies of these discourses of authenticity. So I think I lost a slide. Well, you'll see. So one that claims yogic essences and one that rejects yogic essences. So we see this divide in an active debate in what I call local knowledge and universal knowledge. So these are two great slides that might help you visualize what I mean by local knowledge versus universal knowledge. So local knowledge is going to find its roots in India. It's going to rely on lineages. It's going to rely on gurus, on scriptures, on things based in the kind of imagination of an Indic yogic tradition. Universal knowledge is going to base that information in the self and the personal experience of the self, no matter where and when that happens. So I'm going to explain this, and I think the No Sanskrit comes from Core Power Studio in Venice. So local knowledge, I've just said that. Focus on yogic lineages. Indian yogic teachers are the primary source of authority and authenticity. You might imagine, now this is the key point, that you might imagine that if you focus on local knowledge, that this field would be very diverse, right? That you would have lots of South Asian teachers who are teaching alongside their white compatriots, but that's just not the case. In fact, whites dominate the transmission and representation of yoga while legitimating their authority through the localized Indian context or Indic context. In this field, whites become representatives and translators, and as I argue, authors of Indic traditions. We find it a lot in the intersections with kirtan and bhakti and the more devotional senses. And that may be because much of their authority is based in presenting Indic aesthetic bodily comportment, but also sharing Hindu religious knowledge, particularly demonstrating connection to Indian religious exemplars and returning to India for repeated visits. So for these teachers, India and its religious traditions are often framed within the binaries of the materialistic West and the spiritual East, the intellectual West and the heart-centered East. These are all tropes that I'm sure all of you have heard again and again, right? The modern West and the ancient East. Now the trick is we're not inventing those today. These are classic romantic Orientalist reasonings that have been around for a very long time, since maybe early 1700s, mid 1700s, if certainly at their zenith and mid 1800s. The critique of the West, however, lies at its heart. So particularly this belief being that the West has lost its way in modernity and needs Eastern spirituality to rectify the imbalance. I'll give you just a little bit of the dangers. So this is a 2014 Bhakti Yatra advertisement that reads, yearning to go to the motherland of yoga, India imbibes the essence of bhakti. It's a place where people dedicate their lives to the divine in its many forms. India is a playground that does not just please the senses, but satisfies the soul. Bhakti Fest offers a spiritual pilgrimage through India, a land where the streets pulse with spirituality and its people dedicate their lives to the divine in its many forms. So you can hear this, I don't need to unpack it very much for you, but Indian life is spiritual. It is bhakti, the very streets are spiritual. Indians are devoted, and more importantly, it's a place suited for spiritual pilgrimage, and it's a playground for Westerners. When I teach this in class, I show it alongside the Coldplay video where they're playing Holi in India, right? This kind of playground of India, reenacting these Orientalist tropes. Bija Rivers, who was another yoga teacher in these fields, starts off a lot of her classes at Bhakti Fest saying, greetings to all the crazy God people. And she's excited that at Bhakti Fest, she can allow her inner bhakta to come out of the closet. She too opened up her class at Wanderlust Mont Tremblant in Quebec in 2014, saying that there were aspects of the sadhana that you should please share, but then also aspects of the sadhana that you had to go to India to learn, and that she had been going back and forth to India and wanted to share this with her classes because it was a good way to practice on the raw earth with the awakening of the instinctual body to find roots or to get grounded in roots. So you can see the kind of Laura Christine Graham's research analyzes yoga journal publications, and reveals that for many contemporary yogis, the East itself signifies authenticity and the West inauthenticity. Therefore, as a result, yogas produced solely within Western modern cultures are inauthentic because those cultures are inauthentic in themselves. That was a really, really concise way of thinking through this. Okay, so then on universal, and this is an altar at Bhakti Fest, which kind of shows this attention to roots, to gurus, to Indic religious figures, and to devotional practices. So I'm gonna blow through this a little bit quickly, and I apologize, but universal knowledge on the flip side of this. So this universal knowledge puts the emphasis on intuitive experience of the individual practitioner. So these practitioners, they may see yoga as India's gift to the world, but now that that gift has been given, they consider it to be universal knowledge that can and should be disconnected from its Indian roots. And I'll show you just a few examples of this. This was Michael Blaine, who is a studio owner that I met at Bhakti Fest, and he said he was really frustrated. I think he had recently lost his yoga studio, and he was a white guy, and he felt like that it was a lot of bias toward Indian yogis over himself, I think. So he said, if any Indian teacher comes over from India here, the Westerners are just so ready to do anything. And the people, and you gave the example of Bikram at the time, he's capitalized on that somewhat ignorance of the white man so tremendously, and they're not stopping. $8,000 for a teacher training, $10,000 for a teacher training, and they get that because their last name is Indian or because they're Indian. Foolish, it's foolish. He says it's all about the person's heart. It should be about the teacher's heart and their caring and their knowledge and their wisdom, but that doesn't come from India. It could come from anybody who's done vision quests or whatever. You could go around the corner and sit in an alley and sit all day and discover a hell of a lot. You kind of hear it's kind of jaded as he's talking. Asher Grayson was a famous meditation teacher whom I talked to, and he was very frustrated with the ways in which people who are looking for experience, are very hungry for experience, are going to India on some kind of quest. And he said, whereas the people that preserve the tradition tend to be little boys who never experienced anything. And so they go to India land, and it's just like Disneyland. I'll go see this guru, I'll take this ride and that ride. And he kind of felt like that was a distraction or even damaging to the spiritual path, kind of a waste of time. Another thing that universal knowledge does is it, I think almost Mark Singleton's work has been influential here, where there's a notion that, well, if yoga was made up at one point, then we might as well make things up, right? So this is Jordan Light, who says, he's a famous yoga teacher, and he was speaking again at Wanderlust in 2014. He said, if you see things like revolved archer and you say, I don't know that, that's because I made it up. And I make things up all the time. I made it all up because a lot of you are like, you can't make up yoga, but it's all made up. Every part of yoga is made up. Somebody went, okay, I think I'll call it Warrior 2. But you can't get stuck in this idea that yoga was like a product that can be passed down like a product. He said it's a process and it just keeps evolving and changing and growing. And I like his endpoint. He says, yeah, so that's what it is. I make shit up all the time. So there you go. He also had this kind of fundamental understanding of a postmodern notion of a lack of a singular truth. So he said, no person can know truth. And I'm going to skip a little bit. He said, so you might say this is the truth. If it's absolutely true for you, then it's the truth. And then he says, but truth can only be captured in a moment, in this beautiful moment of all parts of you and everything coming together and that moment being expressed. That's truth for that moment, and that changes. So this notion that the whole tradition or knowledge system is based in your inter-experience. And this is a seminal scholar of spirituality, Paul Heelis, has suggested that this authority, and here in the bottom in yellow, he talks about the authority of experience, most critically, is the key to kind of spiritual, what he calls spiritualities of life, or these fundamental spiritual theological ideas. So that's kind of how, so the first chapter is kind of this big, broad brushstroke. The second chapter is a lot of rhetorical analysis, both coming to terms that no matter where you are on the spectrum between local knowledge and universal knowledge, within a generation or two, it's mostly white teachers teaching to white students in the classroom. So these are strategies of crafting authority in a tradition that may not be your own roots. And as I was feeling pretty down about this idea, not quite knowing what to do, I met Nico, who was a DJ, and he was African-American, and we were hanging out at this bar in Lightning in a Bottle on a very hot day, and we crawled into a covered wagon together, and the irony of that is pretty funny if you're thinking about settler colonialism and whiteness and all of that. But we did, and I said, hey, what do you think about the crowd? And he said, you know, it's a lot of white people who are like embracing other cultures and, you know, doing yoga and wearing headdresses from native cultures. And, you know, it's kind of cool. And I was shocked. And I said, really? You know, you think that's cool? Like, you're not upset about that? And he said, you know, I think culturally speaking, white people are on a journey of evolution, of like embracing these cultures and like getting to the point where they're more aware of what's going on. And they are on a journey because however many years ago, it was a totally different climate, and you have to realize it's going to take time for that, and it's not going to happen overnight. So throughout this conversation, he commented on cultural appropriation. He talked about the importance of representation and solidarity. In his view, the problem lies in structures of white supremacy that enable whites not only to represent non-white cultures, but to eclipse non-white voices because of their promotion by the mainstream. These are the pressing issues, whether it's hip hop or sweat lodges or yoga. The fundamental question is, what responsibility do participants in religious exoticism have to the living populations who are located within the cultures from which they're gaining inspiration? So framed in this way, yoga in the United States is dominated by lithe white women who are generally disengaged with pressing issues facing South Asian or South Asian American communities. And these issues might be immigration reform, visa issues, religious representation in textbooks, fighting hate crimes, building strong communities through temple construction or festivals, museum exhibitions, and networking. But the US imaginary of contemporary Indians in India is often a flat one, conjoined with archaic impressions of impoverished, suffering bodies and spiritual mystical knowledge. Where there are moves to diversify and decolonize yoga, and there are many, they tend to focus on contemporary American progressivist ideals, including like LGBTIQ inclusion or body positive movements or POC yoga spaces and so on. If you were actually looking for partnership with South Asians though, there's very little of that. So with that said, as I immersed myself in these fields, I found that there were profound personal transformations taking place. And I want to take just a minute to talk about that. So participants explained repeatedly that the practice of yoga and their multiple spiritual engagements in these fields changed their lives, sometimes in absolutely radical ways. Their descriptions ranged from subtle changes to developing more life balance, patience, sanity, calm, quietude, mental clarity, compassion, empathy, practical life choices like buying and consuming organic foods or considering social justice and fair trade purchases, volunteering in their local community. Many, and I was actually surprised at this number, but many, and I could give dozens of examples here, changed their professions in order to participate in alternative communities that operated in symbiosis with their developing spiritual ideas. So I met ex-prison guards and ex-butchers and ex-corporate lawyers who all of a sudden were yoga teachers and artists and sound bath healers and professional meditators. And probably some of the students who come to LMU for a master's in yoga studies have done this, right? Left behind a career to do something more in line with their values. So I use the lens of asceticism, as I mentioned, and mysticism to think through these personal transformations. And as people breathe in the light and breathe out the darkness and numerous yoga classes, workshops, and rituals, they exhale pain and trauma and come to a place of power in order to free themselves. In turn, they explain these festivals as, quote, pressing a reset button, reminding me of my values, rejuvenating with an amazing vibe filled with love and positive energy. This dialogical process of emptying and filling the self in contact with wondrous presences makes these fields abundant in their capacity to catalyze transformational experience. And the very last chapter addresses the most common emotion repeated again and again in these fields among my interlocutors was a feeling of freedom. So the vast majority understood transformational festivals as spaces of freedom. But that kind of led me to question, in what systems are these social elites imprisoned to the extent that they experience such radical feelings of freedom once extricated from them? So these are the winners, right? The people who are largely successful and healthy and wealthy at the kind of top of the capitalist food chain. What are they looking for? So the success, and I'm going to conclude with just a few more, is somewhat less revealing than the critique of the status quo, that the suggested alternative that resides at its nucleus. So this critique serves as the generative nexus for any potential utopia and reveals much about the society from which it arises. So that's in a long way to say that utopias are envisioned in contradiction to the perceptions of existing reality or utopia. In order to have a utopia, you have to have a utopia that you're trying to get away from. So then what are the characteristics of life for white, upper middle class, educated, liberal, SBNR populations, mostly from urban environments in late capitalist modernity? What is the problem that these festivals aim to fix? And there's really no easy answer here, but I tried to glue together what participants articulated as the benefits of the festival, and then by taking their inverse, I think we can paint a bit of a picture. So to begin with, most fundamentally, festival participants believed that they felt at home. You look at this little home sign, those are very popular all over these festivals. So they felt that they had come home to a safe space of supportive community. And these feelings of safety and security were directly related to feelings of openness, connection with others, joy, and freedom. So then if we take the inverse of this, that would be an unsafe space, a precarious place in which one feels not at home, or in other words, displaced. A society in which one feels isolated and disconnected from others, confined, unfree, and as a result, unhappy. So in 2000, the renowned sociologist Robert Putnam released a large-scale longitudinal study on diversity, in which he argued just that. In short, he quips, quote, "Diversity brings out the turtle in all of us," meaning that in diverse environments, people recluse and isolate. It's likely that some of the participants related these feelings of safety, security, and coming home in festival environments directly to the homogeneous festival demographics. But I also think that this is not only racialized, and that it's also the creation of an ideological commons, or a space of dreaming in common that tends to minimize diversity and engender feelings of safety, openness, and connection with others, and freedom. So these communities exhibit a high level of what Putnam calls bonding social capital. So building groups between themselves. And I'm just gonna show you, oh, there we go, a happy cuddle puddle at Burning Man, right? Very close network of people. But because there's not a lot of diversity, you don't have the opportunity for bridging social capital. That is to build relations with people who are different from oneself. So in a somewhat cyclical manner then, the ideological commons defaults into this gated commons that solidifies ethnic boundaries. It generates feelings of coming home to your people and your tribe and freedom, but it also reproduces the population's homogeneity. And I found this not only with regard to ethnicity, but in fashion and in moral codes and behavioral conventions that, to me, it was a great irony, the level to which people extricated from their social mores and systems and confines recreated those very same confines, even when they had the opportunity to do otherwise. So although participants in transformational festivals are transported to radically extra-social environments, they bring their learned social behaviors with them. And of course they do. Although you may try to reject them or at least suspend them, a lifetime of habitus is not so easily undone in the course of a weekend. But these festivals, I really argue, have a unique opportunity to bring diverse communities into spaces of empathic connection, where there's an opportunity to bridge social, cultural, and ethnic boundaries. In the aesthetic and mystical practices in these contemporary utopias, participants are already engaged in sustained exercises that defy conventional boundaries. They experiment with discomfort, mental, emotional, physical discomfort, and they're skillful at building solidarities among strangers and cultivating affective feelings of communitas based in shared human experience. So if their utopian visions, however, are going to become actually plausible utopias, then they'll need to apply those carefully honed skills to a wide variety of people and not just their own demographic. So throughout the book, I unravel what I see as a problem. And I think that being aware and discussing the problem and kind of looking at it carefully with clear eyes is part of the very first step that we need to do. And I'm not a constructivist or a constructive theologian or anything like that. I'm a historian and a sociologist, anthropologist of religion. But I did keep coming back around to what Leela Gandhi puts forward as the politics of friendship. And she builds on Aristotle to do so. And the idea that sharing culture in a cosmopolitan world is integral. We can't escape it. We are going to share with each other. We are going to have affinities with people who are different than ourselves. But that friendship speaks to shared entanglements and mutual exchange, mutually beneficial exchange, a lack of control and openness to the unknown. And that in friendship between two radically different subjects, there would be mutual representation, benefit, and solidarity. And if we actually diversified and created close friendships, we would want to rise each other up, right? To lift all boats. And I think that's really different than what we have now, which is a dominant group usurping, controlling, possessing, and representing a historically subordinated other. That's not friendship, and I would argue nor is an expression of true affection or love. So I'll leave you with that, and we can talk all about everything that is there. There's so much that I was not able to do, but thank you. I appreciate it. Do you want me to unshare maybe, and then if I can get out here. Did I get out? So how'd I do? Oh, a little long, I apologize.
That was wonderful. I'm giving hand thumbs up and applauses, both animated and real.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm super happy to take questions. I know that we only have a bit of time, but I'll stay, whatever.
Yeah, so Taina just posted a PDF in the group or in the chat here that is a little bit more about your book for those interested. So thanks, Taina, for that. We do have a few minutes for questions. Feel free to either use your voice or put them in the chat box. There must be a few who have attended some of these festivals. I'm curious on those reflections.
Yes, I'll just start out. I know that Amanda and I have seen each other, for instance, at Bhakti Fest. And I really appreciated how you identify the very interesting feeling that on the one hand is very happy, but on the other hand, what is the origin of that feeling of safety, that feeling of home? And I would like to problematize just a little bit, for instance, with that photograph where everyone was cuddling. Not everybody in that photograph was white. And I'm wondering to what extent does the fellowship feeling flatten ethnic distinctions or gender distinctions or whatever else it may be?
Yeah, totally. I absolutely think so. I mean, and that's kind of part of the point is like that photo is from Burning Man, right? Which is, as of 2017, like 77% white. So that's the most diverse of these festivals. So I do think that that kind of, I have a large section, many of them in the book actually, about like the ways in which these spaces open up opportunity for people to get close quickly, right? They get close very quickly. They get very raw and very vulnerable and very open. People come to these events ready to share and ready to connect. And so when there is diversity there, I think these festivals can do amazing things for connecting across social boundaries that exist in the default world that maybe don't exist as hard or as fast in the festival. But when they're only attracting a singular demographic or, you know, the gist of a singular demographic, then those connections happen, but they happen within group, right? So I think that in some ways the answer is not to like cancel festivals, who wants to do that, but to diversify festivals and to let them show their strengths and actually kind of make the magic.
Wonderful. A question came in, 2 questions. One you just hit on, but in case you want to expand a little bit, from Martin. What do you think is the extent of possible positive effects that diverse festivals can have on society? So taking it a step further, what are the implications in a broader societal context?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just said the most important thing to me, which is interpersonal connection, like to actually see someone, to get real very quick, to break down these boundaries. I mean, I'll tell you, my mom's here. Hi, Mom. But I came back from Burning Man last year, like 10 minutes before parent teacher, what was it, like open house class night. And I had to go to my 5th graders class, and I went in and I hugged everybody. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so happy to see you. It's been a whole year. And my daughter was mortified, of course. And it's just a different way of acting, right? Like we limit ourselves in our day-to-day kind of lives and say that we're separate from other humans, when in fact, the festival teaches us that we're not. So I think that's one of the strongest things that happens out there, that can and should happen, and we'd have a different world if it did.
Awesome. And one more question from Nicholas. What do you think, or how do yoga festivals impact modern religious conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have, in your question, hit on one of the key things, which is that there's so much diversity that automatically I have to say, what do you mean by yoga festival, right? Because there's diversity really broadly through this notion of transformational festival, spiritual festival, yoga festival. If you're talking about something like the Wanderlusts, I'm not sure they create a lot of religious conflict, but if you're talking about like Modi's International Yoga Day, I would say definitely you have a crisis of representation that he's putting forward in Indian Hinduism politics. So it depends on what you're talking about and the particular context in which it exists. I mean, I'll leave it there, but yeah.
You know, it seemed as though, the festivals are great, just like conferences. You know, you go to a conference, you get worked up. After the conference is over, everybody goes back home. And we have a very diverse population, very segmented, and they don't see one another outside the festival, usually. But, there's some, there's some that do connect a little with diverse populations outside of the festivals. But, we're kind of segregated, and there are not a lot of opportunities outside of the festivals to connect in most places.
Yeah, I would say certainly on the last day of a lot of these festivals, there's a lot of emphasis on how do we bring this back into our communities? How do we maintain this community? And some festivals are doing that more than others. For example, Burning Man, there's a whole bunch of burners who get together year round. Wanderlust, not so much. It's more like a vacation feel. But then again, some whole yoga studios I've seen arrive together at Bhakti Shakti Fest, and the yoga studio then serves as the kind of year-round connectivity, or kirtan groups as well. Mm-hmm. Like they have a whole society that the festival is just one part of it. But yeah, I do think that it's only reflective of larger issues of ethnic and social stratification in our society. Absolutely, you're spot on, of course. I'm trying to read while looking at you guys.
Yeah, I can summarize a few of them together, kind of alluding to methods for diversification.
Yeah, I actually had a very uncomfortable conversation with the CEO of Burning Man about that. First of all, I never thought that I would be sitting around talking to the CEO of Burning Man, and nor did I think that she would turn to me and say, okay, so what do we do? And I was like, I don't know, go ask your people. Like, I'm just an anthropologist. I just told you how it looks. But I think my answer was right, in a sense that there are so many leaders of color in these festivals who are overlooked and not tapped into for the rich resources that they have to offer their own communities. I know that Shakti and Bhakti Fest had a struggle with the South Asian community of them not feeling welcomed. And so I think there's already ways in which they can tap into people who are leaders and not necessarily listen to like a white outsider like myself to lead the way. That's not the way forward, right? So be listening to their own people and offering them, really not just listening, but I would say taking action and offering them positions of leadership, paid positions of leadership.
Great. I think that sums up. There's one last question. Underlying need. Could you speak more to the possible underlying need to appropriate? Anything you want to add about appropriation or about ways that we might be able to look at that in the context of festivals moving forward?
Yeah, and then I also want to answer Serenity's before we all sign off, if that's okay, just for ethic reasons. But I'm not a psychologist. I'm really not a psychologist, but I have heard several people give talks recently talking convincingly to me about kind of whiteness and colonization as a violence against all people, including white people who lost their identities and then were part of this kind of nebulous, empty category that was only based on a fake ideal. So then they kind of felt like they wanted to go search for roots somewhere, and that white people kind of are then in a bind that if they go like take pride in their Irish identity, that they're potentially signified as racist. This is not my field. I don't potentially imagine that I can like read into the psychology of a whole demographic of people. But I do think the searching for roots is part of this story. Absolutely. And it may have a reason for why people are looking. It also could just be, the isolation of capitalism. It could be any number of things that make us dissatisfied in modernity. So I'm uncomfortable saying it's about one thing. But I did share my findings. So to answer Serenity's question, did you share your findings with the authorities of these festivals? If so, how did they respond? So yeah, I shared my findings with everybody who was quoted in the book, and then also each of the festivals, and worked with them to get photograph permissions for the book. The one that was kind of strictest about it actually was Burning Man, because they are very much interested in controlling the message and their logo and their representation. And so they asked to like read a copy of the book. And one of their Burning Man staff members did read a copy of the book, and he offered me really wonderful feedback, and I was very grateful for it. So that was a good experience. Of the people who were quoted, who read the book, I would say 95% of them were really excited and stoked about the pseudonym that I chose for them. And then maybe I would say 3 or 4 yoga teachers, some of the ones that were the most famous and concerned about their Instagram image, were furious. They were furious that I was saying that they were white. And they were furious to be in the category. They were furious to be in the book. And it was interesting because I talked to my IRB board, my institutional review board for human subjects research, and kind of said, what do I do? Like, they're claiming that I am slandering them, but this is a demographic fact, right? This is not an insult or anything. This is who you are. And so 2 of them I ended up pulling from the book at their request because they threatened legal action. And so I just erased them from the book, even with their pseudonym. And the other 2 we negotiated and walked our way through it back and forth. But, Sean Korn recently this week said that she was deleting comments on her Instagram handle. I don't know if you all saw that, because she's getting so much hate from the yoga community about white supremacy and QAnon. And I really wish she wouldn't, because we need to see those comments. We need to see what this community is and the kind of underbelly of the beauty of it as well at the same time. Yeah, Iana, is that right?
Ayana.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, you said where was the whites only sign when it came to these festivals? And I would challenge and say there's no explicit sign, but I think the cost barrier to a lot of these festivals, as well as the length of time, and those communities of color, people who actually have expendable time to be able to travel and go to these festivals. I think that may be your whites only sign if you really start to unpack societal norms, and the systemic problems that have kept certain groups of people of color in a certain position. They're not then able to have these expendable experiences, because I have seen the cost for some of these festivals. I myself have considered possibly going and have said, oh yeah, no, that's not going to work. Taking 2 weeks in Burning Man or a weekend when you're spending upwards of $6,000, it's not possible. So I wonder if if they're looking at ways to maybe integrate more to communities of color, maybe that's an area to kind of look at and think about.
Yeah, and that's all true, right? That is very much all true. And they are prohibitive to some extent for some communities, especially communities who don't feel like they have the wherewithal to kind of just do it on nothing, right? There's some kind of a hubris that says, I'm just going to jump in my van and show up and it's going to be okay. And I know a lot of people who do that as well and live on Spirulina or whatever they live on for the weekend, and they get a free ticket because they do Seva or whatever. So these are not only playgrounds for the wealthy. And I also, while I appreciate the facts of what you're saying, I also kind of want to push back on the notion that like people of color are poor. Like certainly for, not in general, you know what I mean? But like certainly not for the South Asian community. Like that is not the case there's lots and lots of wealthy people of all different demographics who could attend and don't attend. So, yeah. I should mention that I guess in response to that kind of line of thinking, Burning Man is, I believe, expanding its low-income ticket option and also offering high-income ticket options. They are doing all kinds of interesting things. So like if you're extraordinarily wealthy, like if you are, like I've met Beyonce or, Bill Gates or somebody on Playa and they want to pay $1 million per ticket or $1,000 or $3,000, they can.
A couple of years ago, I attended a International Association of Yoga Therapists conference. I think it was in Rawson or something close to that. And there were very few Black folks there or any other folks of color. And, I had to dig into my pocket to get there. And one of the in-between sessions, these 3 white ladies walked up to me and we got to chit-chatting, and they said, do you practice? And I'm like, what the hell am I doing here? Do I practice? And so I just let it go and said, yes, I practice. And then for lunch, I walked out the back door and Rawson was having a street festival. And it was the best thing that ever happened. Music, food, right outside the hotel. I couldn't get back into the yoga conference, it was just a little too abstract. But any rate, I provide service to folks in medically underserved areas, specializing in older adults. And I'm comfortable with that. I can't charge the same thing that the folks at Loyola Marymount charge for a class. I may not get students, and I don't even want to go there. I want to capture another audience. And so, you know, it works, but, you know, I don't know. It's, folks see a Black yoga student or a Black yoga teacher, and it's like, do you really teach? Do you really teach yoga? You know, it's a sad day, but it works, you know.
Yeah, I think that I love your stories. Thank you. And I think that there are lots of little things like that that make people feel unwelcome. And I think it happens all the time. And I think it happens for South Asians as well in these spaces who are either called on to represent or told that they're representing incorrectly. I think that that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with this kind of the hubris of once you create an all-white space, it's not going to be sensitive to multiple perspectives. And I think that's part of the problem.
Right. One other comment. In 1968, I was hired into Loyola Marymount University as the director of the Black Studies program. And I was assistant professor in the sociology department. I had many, many, many students, and this was basically an all-white campus, who said, this is the first time I ever talked to a Black man, you know, males and females. And I'm not sure that it's that much different right now, you know. And it's no interaction.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that in some ways, that's what I'm calling for. If I'm calling for anything, it's for this politics of friendship, is to get close is what, and I think in trying to do that, we will realize how far apart we are. And it's very easy, essentially, if we do nothing, then it follows patterns of white hegemony. It naturally will do that unless we act otherwise, unless we go like salmon swimming up the stream.
Yeah, I'd like to just say hello to Robert Taylor and
Robert.
I'm Chris Chappell at LMU. I would love to get together and chat and talk about people that we know in common. Hopefully you remember John Davis.
Sure.
Dear friend. So yeah, we're doing what we can at LMU and our department's thriving in African American studies.
You're doing a lot, and I'll get back to you.
Excellent, excellent. Easy to find on the website.
Okay, John Davis, okay.
Should I think about Tana's question? Am I saying your name right? You can tell me if I'm wrong.
Hyena.
Hyena, sorry, thank you. So she says, think about the pipeline of how and where these festivals, specifically Wanderlust, Bhakti Shakti, LIB, promote, market, and place their emphasis for attendance. The proximity to whiteness starts much farther back than the actual festival itself. Yeah, absolutely. And it speaks to the values of the entity creating it. I think that's absolutely true. And the people recruiting for it. So it's almost like this pattern of snowballing that I was trying to kind of get out in my talk of that white begets white. So if white people are recruiting for the festival in their circles of friends, which as Dr. Taylor was just telling us are isolated and ethnically homogenous oftentimes and stratified in society, they're gonna draw in their friends who are more gonna be like them. And I know this because like 2 years ago, I had a co-lead for the bakery and she was Thai American and half of our camp was Thai. She was amazing and wonderful and a wonderful recruiter. And she recruited all of her friends to come and build a bakery with us in the desert. And we ended up with all of her friends. So I think that that's really important. I also think that Heather's point to them looking for who's going to draw a crowd, who is an influencer, also has impact. But then again, I think this year, and I don't want to speak to this year because obviously I mentioned that the research formally ended in 2019. But I do think that the consequences for having an all-white festival this year were great enough for it to be seen as a negative and potentially deleterious financial investment for them. Essentially, they were like, if we do this all white, we're going to get canceled. So it's very diverse this year. So I do think there is a financial calculus where the influencers are the main draw, but then also if you run an all white lineup right now, no one is able to do that in this political climate. Well, I hope not. We'll see how things go next year, but there's a point where the math changes, and I hope that math kind of continues to change in this direction. I'm gonna keep answering questions. There's more in there. I don't want to keep y'all, but as maybe one last bit on Heather. Why do I think South Asians don't attend? That's a very, very complex question. There's all kinds of reasons. Christopher Wallace put up a Facebook post in 2015, which is in the book, which is essentially why is the post was, is Shakti Fest racist for not having South Asian performers? And it got like 400 comments. And there were discussions in those comments about why South Asians don't attend. Some argued that they were disinvited, some argued that they weren't paid well, or that they were offered poor time slots. So that's a reason. Certainly there are plenty of kirtan musicians in California of South Asian descent that they could bring in. It's not a problem of availability. But I also think that there's a real divide. I just read a wonderful book that's going to be coming out next year about Hindu diaspora this morning. And there's still a real divide between people who are Western or white and interested in guru movements, yoga, Hindu ideas, or I should say South Asian ideas, and South Asians who tend to create communities that are supporting their particular interests, such as networking and education and, you know, whatever their interests are. So there's a divide there, and I've written about that in other places, but I think we're continue to see this. Y'all have great questions. I really appreciate this audience. It's so nice to be with people who know a lot about what they're talking about and are familiar with what I'm talking about. So thanks for sharing this time with me. I really appreciate it.
Well, I want to thank you, Amanda, because it's so good to have ourselves reflected back to ourselves. And I find the Zoom environment so fascinating because we are able to interact in a way that is not exactly a level playing field, but it's certainly interesting that your audience is present in a different way. And I'm sort of just fascinated by this whole process. And I do look forward to those moments in the future when we can all be together in proximity. And this has been a very good stand-up. You know, we're doing great. Thank you. The book is amazing. I love the photographs, and we will make sure that the library gets a copy right soon.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lucia.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Stay well.
Bye.